Are you ready? G'day ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Draw with Jazza. I'm Jazza, and in this video we're going to be talking a bit about perspective. Now the context of this video is that this is me creating my contribution to the book 21 Draw. So if you're not aware of this, 21 Draw was the most funded ever Indiegogo campaign, and they recently re-kickstarted a new book after their successful first book, and this next 21 Draw book features a whole bunch of different artists covering a lot of the fundamentals of drawing principles. And I will today be demonstrating what I go through in the book in regards to perspective. Perspective is sort of like an illusion. It's a bit of a magic trick. Basically, all of the illustrations or artworks that you create are fake because they're pretending to be three-dimensional on a two-dimensional surface. Perspective is one of the most useful tools you will have on your tool belt to create that illusion. And there are several different key aspects and approaches that you can use to harness the power of perspective. The first thing I want to cover is what we call one-point perspective. What I have here is a horizon line and a point. Basically, this represents space, or the very foundation of how we're going to create the illusion of space. This point on the horizon line is a point at which all elements of our image converge and eventually join up. If I draw a bunch of lines that just go randomly out, no matter how far away from each other these lines are, as long as they all go out immediately from this point, they can all create that sense of perspective. Without using a horizon or without harnessing that point of perspective, we end up with a square. And as you can see, it's not a very three-dimensional looking box. It has one surface. However, if I were to draw the same size box a little bit further along, and then at the corners of this box, I follow these perspective lines that I have and have it head towards that point in the horizon, we've all of a sudden created a third dimension. We have our front plane, which conveys height and width, but now we have an extra dimension of depth, and these perspective elements that we're going to be using through this video help create that feeling of depth. Now, as you can see, these boxes are placed above and below that horizon line, which means that the side and the bottom of the box that I'm creating are going to be viewed. All of these lines are going in at different angles because they're all heading immediately towards this point in the horizon, the same point that all of the boxes are heading towards. This can be represented through other shapes as well. So for example, I could create a cylinder by having what would normally look like a circle, but if I use these perspective points and add those extra lines and the extra edge, we can create an additional surface on that cylinder. Already with these very simple shapes, as you can see, I've created the illusion of depth. So I'm going to put this into some context. I'm going to take my horizon line and I'm going to very roughly sketch out a bunch of lines. So the first thing I want to draw is a road. So using one of these lines as a guide, I'm going to draw out one side of the road and then another side of the road. Now you'll notice it's actually off balance. It's not completely centered or exactly in the middle. And that's good because otherwise it would be a little bit predictable and uninteresting. But by creating an unbalance, it adds a little more visual interest. I'm going to add a path on each side of the road by just doing another line here, and I'm going to create some lines indicating the division between the path. Now, something I need to start pointing out here is that as we get closer and closer to this vanishing point, this dot that we're working everything towards, everything gets closer together. So all of these lines dividing the path also get closer together, all the way up into the point where you can barely see them and you can barely differentiate the divisions between them. I'm actually going to add some lamp posts to the scene. I'm going to need a couple of extra lines here to follow for the street lamps. And rather than draw all the details first, I'm going to draw just the basic lamp post first. And you'll see that the distance between these two is going to be quite a lot longer than the distance between the next one I place. And this is a repeating aspect. So the next lamppost I place after that is actually going to be even closer to that one, and so on and so forth. And this, again, is repeated on the other side of the road. And then after that, I can add extra elements in the scene like the lamp posts themselves. We can use our basic lines that we've created using our guides and our reference points to then add the details built upon them. So these are sort of used as construction lines to help put our scene together before we add the details that really build the environment. So as you can see, using those aspects of Onepoint Perspective, you can create a scene that has that illusion of depth. And if I hide my reference lines and even that horizon vanishing point, you can see that all of a sudden this scene feels like it has place, it has a scope of size and things like that. The next method is called TwoPoint Perspective, where, as you might have guessed, if I take this one point of perspective and copy it, all of a sudden I have 2 points, and we use these 2 points as vanishing points on opposite ends of our scene to create that illusion of depth, and we get a very different feel. It creates a much more open scope. Now, the basic principle is the same. If I draw lines out from these points, both of them, even if they converge or cross over, can be used as guides to create open, large scenes. Now, something to keep in mind with TwoPoint Perspective is that the closer these 2 points are, the more squished in everything's gonna feel. So something you can actually do is really pull those lines out to a point that's actually not visible on the screen. So I'm going to keep these dots here, but I'm just going to draw a little arrow to these sides here so you can see that I'm actually indicating that the point that the lines are drawn to is off of the screen. So now basically the placement of shapes and objects is similar to Onepoint Perspective, except of course you're being drawn in 2 different directions. And with Onepoint Perspective, normally you would start with your flat surface and then create all the lines from that are drawn to the other point. So what we tend to do in TwoPoint Perspective is start off with a corner and then create the line that's heading off in the direction of our perspective vanishing points. So I've got a rough little box here, and I'm going to turn this into a town scene as well. So we might go with a bit of an old school Tudor style house. So to do this, let's bring out the upper layer. So we're going to divide this into 2. So we still have our normal box shape, but we're just sort of adding different definitions here. Now to draw the roof, first let's find the middle point of our building, and we can have the roof sort of come up like this. Now this is a helpful little way of doing angles and roofs, because the reality is you wouldn't think to draw a roof like that. We have a shorter side here for this part of the roof and then a much longer side on the other side, but because it's on this angle, we can use things around us and the perspective points and lines to act as a reference and a guide as we create angles and shapes that don't necessarily follow those perspective lines and points. So for example, let's say other objects on this building, let's have a front door out here, and let's have a back corner door over here. The straight lines that are going up are pretty much just straight. We don't need to follow any other perspective lines, but all of the lines that are horizontal are following these basic perspective guides, and we can draw in sort of semi-guides, other little subtle guides that follow the basic perspective direction, and then draw our refined shapes on top. So we can follow this the same way through the rest of the picture, and let's just throw in a couple more windows. And now we can add the framing to our Tudor style house just simply by drawing in some of these lines. And the result is an object or building that feels like it's solid. It has dimension to it. And then beyond this, we can add other shapes and other objects using the same perspective lines and build a scene around it, which I'm going to do right now. So this is the result. This is my finished medieval scene using 2-point perspective, and I hope you saw through the speed up sort of how I came up with the guides as I drew all the other elements in this scene. But if I were to go through and re-highlight some of the main guides, there would be these for the house, and then there's more up here for the castle, so I'll draw that one there. Then we have some on the ground here for the path, and then some extra lines here for the card. And then if I show nothing but my line guides and the finished line work of the image itself, you can see pretty clearly how everything is drawn relative to each other to these two vanishing points in the image that are used as a guide to help create that sense of depth and add a very open feel to the perspective and the three-dimensional illusion that we're creating. So we've covered 1-point and 2-point perspective. I bet you can't guess what comes next. 3-point perspective. Basically, we have a horizon just like we have with 1 and 2-point perspective, with 1 point far to the left and 1 point far to the right. And then obviously with 3-point perspective, we have a third point here. And we're just gonna drag this all the way down. And all of these dots are going to be off screen, much like with our 2-point perspective. We can allude to them, and we're going to create some lines coming from each of these points. Of course, the third point can be anywhere, and often the third point is up and above the horizon, which creates a real sense of drama and scale, like we're looking up at something. And in this situation, with the point at the bottom, it's going to really feel like we're looking down at a scene. And one of the reasons 3-point perspective is useful is because we get to, beyond creating a very open scene, add a huge amount of vast scale to it. So with 3-point perspective, with the third point below the horizon, we're really looking down and we're getting to encompass a lot of a scene around that. And likewise with the point at the top of the horizon, we're looking up and it's really pulling everything in and around that perspective. Now, as with 2-point perspective, the closer everything is together, the more squished it's going to feel. So I'm actually going to scale this up and stretch it. And you'll notice even then that it makes things look a little more open. So now I'm going to draw a box in this scene, and I'm using the lines in the environment as a guide rather than using them to sort of trace or copy and draw exactly along them. So for example, here with these vertical lines, I have a reference line here and here that I've drawn, both of which aren't along the edge of this building, but I can use them to find my magic sweet spot to draw this side of the building. This might look like something of a skyscraper. So let's say we have a scene where King Kong is at the top of the skyscraper and doing this whole thing. Next, I'm going to draw a cylinder that comes up from this skyscraper. Now the sides of this are going to be easy to do because we have our lines to follow here. So I'm going to find my center and do my ellipse to that sort of a scale. Now I'm going to do the same for the top. So I have my cylinder edges, but the angle of this ellipse is much more shallow as the perspective has been squished up. And we can use these lines around the scene to help anchor the depth and the scale of our ellipse. So now I'm going to draw the final spire of this building here coming up from this tower. And let's add a bit of a cone shape here. So now that I have my core building, I'm going to add other skyscrapers around the scene. Now this might be a little tricky, but the way we can make it simple is just by drawing the tops of the buildings first, and we can follow these lines to just sort of draw squares like this. And we're going to do this throughout the whole scene, just adding more of these squares, which are going to act like rooftops. Once we've got a couple of these in, we're just going to follow these vertical lines heading down to our third point of perspective. And you'll notice that we get a bit of a warped shape in these buildings. They don't look very normal or very square, but in the context of each other, when they're all next to each other, it feels more like a camera lens is changed rather than the shapes themselves being really warped. So once I've added a few more buildings in from the tops and then the lines going down, we just repeat the process until we fill the scene with more skyscrapers. I can add other little things I want to draw, such as a gorilla, King Kong, on the tower, and maybe an aeroplane flying around as well, because I have all the solid stuff down there. Now, of course, it all looks very blocky right now, but when I get to the line work and adding the details and the characters, all of a sudden things will look much more organic. And so this is the result with the line work, and obviously it looks a bit busy now, but if I hide all of my construction lines, all of the perspective lines and the sketch lines and the boxes, all of a sudden it's a scene, and it doesn't really feel like they're based on just a whole bunch of solid perspective lines. We have a horizon, and then we have a vertical line that's going down to our first point. And when I say points, we have a point on the left and a point on the right. and these are vanishing points, and all of the lines throughout the image are sort of converging at these vanishing points. And then it's here that we used the guidelines of the perspective to create our dramatic scaled image. So now that I've covered 1-point, 2-point, and 3-point perspective, I'm going to move on to a couple of tools and approaches that you can use to help you when drawing perspective. Now, there are other ways you can do fisheye perspective or bended perspective or 4-point perspective, but they're getting a bit crazy, and we're talking about the fundamentals here. So the first tool I want to talk about is using placeholders for scale purposes. So for example, here I have a bit of a wasteland scene, and this is a 3-point perspective scene because you can see the grid here. Now, if I hid my grid, it looks pretty flat. So it's only when I have my grid in for the ground and the sky that you can see that we're looking up. But really, they're not there for the terrain illustration. These perspective guides are there for these boxes that I've created, and these boxes are placeholders. All of a sudden, with these placeholder boxes, we get a much clearer idea as to the scale of this scene. Now, these smaller boxes here are getting smaller the closer they are to this big box. So this big box could be a building, and these smaller boxes could be people, but to make it interesting, I'm going to have these smaller boxes be people and the big box be a giant robot. Now, often when you're drawing scenes where there are things of different scales, by using placeholder boxes like this, we can really rough out where things are going to go and how they feel in size compared to each other. Then once we've created most of the scene and roughed out everything, we can then rough out our objects or our organic components or characters inside these placeholder boxes and then do our final artwork on top. And aside from the 3-point perspective helping add a lot of scale and drama to this image, the way that there are several humans in this image with a very large object or enemy that they're fighting also helps create that sense of scale and drama, and using these frames and boxes to help sort of rough out where they're going to go and what it's going to look like is a huge helpful thing that you can use when drawing things on trickier angles, and especially when using perspective methods like 3-point perspective. So the last thing I want to talk about in regards to perspective is just dynamic application. Now, there's no single right way to do this, but this here is an example of what I'm talking about. When I say dynamic application, I mean the fact that we have a scene here where there's a planet with 3-point perspective going on here. So we have the surface of the ground, and then of course we have a slightly bent third point of perspective going here, meaning that all these lines are sort of bending in towards the third point, the third vanishing point, which is down below here. So that's one aspect of perspective, but then that's also mixed with the fact that we have a plane here with some perspective being applied as well. So if you actually deconstruct this crash landing spaceship, you can see that the lines here are converging to a vanishing point here in the distance, which must be, I suppose, where the ship is coming from. So you don't actually have to stick rigidly by a single 1, 2, or 3-point perspective scene that you lay out. You can add other objects with their own independent, self-contained perspective elements to it to help create an image that feels dynamic and has a lot happening. And in this image in particular, I want to create a sense of drama and make it look like a lot's happening and it's uneasy. So there you go, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining me on this video tutorial on perspective. Once again, this is all artwork that has been created for the 21 Draw book. Make sure to check it out. The link is in the description. Thank you so much for watching, ladies and gentlemen, and until next time, I'll see you later.
Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe to my channel for new content every week. If you want to support my work and get some goodies for yourself, head over to my store for archives, ebooks, digital brushes, video courses, and more. If you enjoyed this video, here's a link to another video you might like from this channel. And if you want even more, make sure to check out all my behind the scenes action on my vlog channel, Daily Jazza. Draw with Jazza is proudly sponsored by Adobe. Join the Creative Cloud today and get loads of incredible creative tools like Photoshop, Animate, Premiere Pro, and other apps for your computer or mobile device. That's it for now. Thanks for joining the Arty Party, and until next time, I'll see you later.